Hello and welcome to AviaDev Insight Africa, the podcast dedicated to air connectivity developments to, from, and within the African continent, with your host, John Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa. Our podcast is your window to the world of aviation in Africa, where we connect with industry experts, thought leaders, and visionaries who are at the forefront of revolutionizing air travel on the continent. Whether you're a seasoned entrepreneur, aviation professional, or simply curious about the exciting developments that exist in African aviation, AviaDev Insight Africa is your trusted source for insights, conversations, and analysis. On today's episode, it's absolutely no different as we welcome back a previous guest, Kirby Gordon, who is the Chief Marketing Officer at FlySafair. FlySafair is a South African airline that is about to embark on a regional expansion, launching routes to Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Mozambique. So our aim today is to understand what's driven this decision-making process and what we can expect from the airline going forward. So welcome back to the podcast, Kirby.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
Fantastic. It's almost 12 months since we last spoke, and we did that interview together during the ARSA conference in Cape Town. And at that point, pretty much that week, you just received allocation of route rights for quite a few regional destinations from South Africa after a hiatus with the Air Service Licensing Council. What you were really keen to point out on that podcast was that any expansion would be thought out. It would take time. You would consider the routes that were there. And as we sit here now, end of September, we're only a few days away from the launch of 4 new regional routes. Of course, you already have dipped your toes with Mauritius and Zanzibar, but these 4 new routes are super exciting. So why now? Why October? And why these routes?
John, I think it's a matter of being ready. I think it took a bit of planning to get these things together. It's obviously a number of destinations going in one time. None of them were existing stations or anything, so we needed to set that up. And there's obviously a lot of work that needs to happen from a regulatory basis to get everything right. But we set our sights on a particular line of flying, which we developed as something that was going to be efficient in the sort of true low-cost fashion of thing, and that had, we believed, some commercial value and some economic value to it. And then we needed to pursue that. And we've had it ready for about now. It gives us a few months to lead up into the very busy summer Christmas season for this period here. So hopefully that'll really serve to give us a moment to entrench the routes, to sell them for that busy period over the South African summer holidays. And the hope is that thereafter it's just onward and upward.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at it from the outside, looking in, on paper, the routes and the markets they're quite different. So Maputo, Harare, traditionally business-focused routes, whereas, of course, Vic Falls, Livingston, are much more leisure-focused potentially. Is the plan to use the business routes point to point and the leisure destinations through your partners, through your interline codeshare partners, and provide that sort of last-mile delivery for the international tourists? Or is there a true market between those destinations anyway?
I think you hit the nail on the head largely. Harare, as a specific example, is fairly low-hanging fruit. There's obviously a lot of connectivity between South Africa and Zimbabwe, and particularly Harare and Johannesburg, for a variety of reasons: business, visiting friends and relatives, even some leisure to a certain extent. So that's quite a well-established kind of connection and something that was quite easy to get into. The Falls, both in terms of Livingston and Vic Falls, is very much more leisure. So that we're seeing a lot more kind of focus on the likes of the tourism packaging wholesaler groups. There will be some MICE work that'll happen in that environment. It's obviously quite a different route entirely. And then Maputo is a little bit more like Harare. There's obviously a number of mining interests that are happening in Mozambique. So there's a bit of business market that we believe that can be tapped in that environment. But frankly, again, we're working the low cost model. Maputo was quite an attractive option to us because of its proximity to Johannesburg. It really allowed us to optimize that line of flying out of the international terminals. So we can do a Harare and then either a Falls or Livingston, given that they're so close to one another. And then there's a gap. There's a little capacity to do another short sector on the back of it. The toss-up was at the stage between Gaborone and Maputo because of their kind of proximity and their distance. And Maputo won the toss. So that's where we ended up. I make it sound like we really left it to chance. We didn't. There were a number more factors that were considered.
We'll get to that shortly, but it is fascinating because, of course, for those people who are listening who aren't overly aware of FlySafair, you've alluded to it already, that low-cost model of high utilization and thinking about the sector lengths and making sure you can provide multiple frequencies and sweat the assets, work the aircraft hard to be able to then make sure the utilization is maximized and bring down the cost for the traveling public. So I think that's a really important point to make and does play a big part in your network planning decisions, right?
Absolutely. These markets are fascinating to us on the low-cost basis, John, because they've not really been very well contested on a true low-cost basis. And moving into Africa with a low-cost model, with a full economy configuration, with fixed recline seats, for example, it's an unknown quantity for us to try and explore. So it really is a matter of testing the waters to a larger extent. We really need to understand what that price elasticity of demand is. We can go in there and offer the seats at a reasonable rate, given our operating model and the way that we can structure costs. But what we really need to determine in the long run is how much more demand can we generate at that price point, and how far does that go? And that'll be a lot of the kind of work that we ultimately do through the likes of AviaDev, where we need to do destination development stuff, where we need to do route development stuff to ensure that we can come to the party and say, look, we're taking the gamble. We've taken the first step here. We've got these affordable flights that are connecting these cities. Now we need to make sure that the rest of the infrastructure comes to the party, which they are, to bring the travel and the traffic and to make them viable in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, because this isn't just new route developments. This is a watershed moment for Southern Africa, that it's a lot of these destinations have never had a truly low-cost operator with the aircraft gauge, the size that you guys have. So talking about that, we have a new podcast out, a new episode that Sean Mendes and I recorded last week, which is our air connectivity podcast, where we discuss the routes that are coming up over the next 3 months, the ones that might happen 6 months' time, whatever it may be. And Sean was at pains to point out that the markets you've chosen are crying out for more capacity. He gave us some numbers based on some data that he'd been able to derive. I'm sure it's not as up to date and as thorough as what you guys are working with in HQ. And of course, you're adding a huge amount of capacity because you operate a fleet of 737-800. I think it's 180 seats, give or take, is it, on the aircraft?
189 on an 800, yeah.
189, which is not what these routes are necessarily used to being served with. So how does it work from a route development perspective? Like when you launch, and I am getting the emails from the marketing team at Safo, which I always do, and they're always great fun. But the load factors that you expect initially, how long it takes to really test this route and bring it up to fruition, are you expecting that to develop, or are bookings strong from the start?
Look, with any new route development, even a domestic one, John, there is always a development curve that you have to go through. And I think that's partly why we poised it as we did before the high season, because there's an opportunity to do that. So we've found that there's a certain psychology that exists, particularly within the South African market. You need to start flying at the route and then really invest upon it in terms of marketing, because I think there seems to be a certain skepticism when you're not actively doing it. So we do see a bit of pickup once we're actually there. And obviously there's a degree of word of mouth. I flew to Harare on Saturday. So that kind of seems to help a lot from that. So no matter what the route is, even if it's a domestic one, we recently just relaunched Cape Town to George, which is trodden route and quite an easy one. But again, same thing. Once you're actually flying it, you see a lot more pickup. So it is a little bit slower on this front. I think with the exception of Harare, which is just so well traded, we definitely are expecting this to be a little bit of a long runway. And we'll continue to push it that way. It needs some time to establish itself. But I think, as I alluded to before, there's a lot of work that can be done and a lot of potential in these destinations. And if we think about the falls, there's an amazing opportunity there. For starters, Livingston in and of itself offers so much as an airport and as a destination, even though it competes quite directly with Victoria Falls, but is the second fiddle in many regards and really has opportunity to be developed fantastically, but as does the falls as a destination generally. And specifically as an opportunity for domestic South African tourists, I personally believe there's a big chance there. So an itinerary that we frequently see from the wholesalers is that you'll have a lot of Europeans that will come down to South Africa. They'll land in Johannesburg. They might do a sort of Kruger trip and have a bush experience on that side. And then they go one of two ways, right? You can either go and see the falls in all their majesty, or you can head down to the winelands. Now, my preference has always been for the winelands for obvious reasons. The falls is a fantastic opportunity to bolt onto the end of that. And there's no reason, given everything that's there and given the amount of investment in that region, that can't become a great destination for South Africans to visit as well, not just the European. We love an island trip. We love a trip to Mauritius. We love the Indian Ocean Islands. We love Zanzibar. I think South Africans, albeit in a tough economy, are also hungry for another destination, and the Falls offers a great opportunity. It's an hour and 40-minute flight. It's right next door.
Yeah, and it's got so much to offer, but most people only go for a very short time. So there is the opportunity to increase the offering to get people to stay longer. I know that's a big sort of focus for the Zimbabwe Tourism Board there.
Yeah.
And I've done it. I've done the whitewater rafting. I didn't do the bungee jumping. I've done that once and I'm never doing it again. So I didn't do it there. So there's so many things for people to see. And it's very different, as you say, as an experience to the winelands. And why not do all of them together? And
Really?
you're just making it more accessible, but also you're focused on that South African outbound market, not just, oh, it's Europeans or Americans that are going to have this experience. Make it accessible for people from South Africa as well. So I think that's really important. What I want to pick up on is a point that you made earlier about the development curve. The reason we set up AviaDev as much as anything else is to make sure that airports and destinations know and understand they have to play their part when it comes to a new route development, not just getting it or hearing about it, but incubating it. If it doesn't work, it can be very detrimental to the airline, but also the airline's really going to be reluctant to go back. So they have to maximize the opportunity. So with that in mind, it'd be really interesting, the support that you got from the countries. And of course, some of these conversations maybe began at AviaDev. So have they been supportive of the launch and given the support that you hope and you're expecting more as the routes come to market?
Most definitely. I think that is, as you say, that's a fundamental element of it. It's a layered approach. So in the first instance, there are obviously those that almost stand to benefit more directly from business relationships. So you get a lot of engagement from the likes of the airport companies and the ground handlers and the fueling companies in those environments. And then the sort of next layer that'll come in will be the tourism development boards in the various countries, which is fantastic to get to them. But where we really need to then start getting down into the meat of it is to really chat to the destinations themselves. So you want those wholesalers on that side. You want the lodges that are involved in that. You want them to be actively pursuing and effectively coming in, because really the way that I think you've articulated quite nicely, the way that it works is we put a whole lot of money on the table as airlines to take a gamble on this route. And the reality is we can't sustain it forever. So it needs to either wash its face by a certain point, or, as you say, we need to get out of the game because we would be stupid to continue. We're not state funded. There's no other prerogative that goes behind it. We need to do it to make money. Otherwise, the aircraft is better deployed on a Johannesburg, Cape Town, which is a kind of a sure thing for the most part. That is the toss-up that we work with. So it's an invitation to say, everyone, let's make this work. We've obviously got skin in the game in a big sense. So come on board and let's make it work. Let's get those groups up there. Let's get that incentive stuff going. Let's fill your beds. Let's fill your taxis. Let's fill your restaurants, and let's make it happen.
And that's the point with route development. It is not the responsibility of the airport. The airport is providing the operation and handling the aircraft, but the responsibility of route development are the people who benefit. I want to spend as little time as possible, with all due respect, in the airport. I want to get into Vic Falls, Maputo, Harare, wherever I'm trying to go, and then spend my money, spend my time in the wider community, which is where these air access initiatives, where you're really engaging with the local stakeholders as a destination, as an airport, saying, this airline is coming. We need to maximize this, but we also need to make sure that we support it. We talk about risk mitigation. That is what it is. It's the airline is taking the risk. You're deploying the aircraft. You're spending all the money on the marketing, putting the route on sale. They're going to get the benefit. So you need to meet halfway, especially in that development curve stage when it needs a bit of support to grow. And these are the conversations that obviously we want to stimulate. And we just need the wider stakeholders to know. And the conversation can be driven by the airports, but the airports don't have the wherewithal to do this themselves. And it isn't ultimately, it shouldn't be their responsibility. It sits at a much higher level than just the infrastructure as much as anything else. So it's really good to make that point for sure. So thank you for helping us do that, because that's the whole purpose of what AviaDev is all about. Okay, so before we go, let's talk about obviously what's next, and then we will finish with the rugby. But we're coming into the South African summer, as you alluded to. So do you see more frequencies being added domestically? Have you got more aircraft coming into the fleet? Or is the focus now get these launched, consolidate over the summer, and then take a look, take a deep breath, go into the summer, survive, hang on, and then look at it again at the end of the summer?
Yeah, that's very much it, John. We've been on a crazy kind of growth curve over the last 18 months at this stage. And so at this stage, there's not a lot of new inputs into the fleet. The South African market domestically has petered out quite nicely now. So we're starting to see a stasis. It's not quite where we were pre-COVID. We're not quite back to the 2019 levels. But what we are seeing is from a viability and a yield perspective now versus the loads, we're starting to see that kind of market equilibrium starting to play out, which means that it's time to stop the crazy kind of land grab cab, so to speak. So we're gonna consolidate. We've got a lot of work to do. We've grown up. We've grown in scale quite considerably, and with that comes a lot that you need to just get back in place. Make sure that you're reinforcing all of the structures. Make sure that everything's got its right processes. That you're carving out the efficiencies where you maybe had thrown caution to the wind just in the interest of expansion for a short period, and that you're really maximizing what you need to do. So that'll be the view going into the summer. I think we're operating about 165 to 170 flights a day. So it's pretty busy. And with these regionals now, these will probably be the last of the new route launches for the year, certainly. We might look at what we need to do to shift around and deploy when we go into the next season now in 2024. And that could be opportunities for more regionals as well. Once we win the Rugby, we'll focus on Christmas.
Yeah, and that really struck me last year when we chatted and spoke to some of the other airlines. Of course, the South African aviation market's fascinating because the size of it has shrunk, but the dynamic and the players have just rejigged. And it would have been tempting to say, there's this huge deficiency in capacity. Let's just go mad and throw loads of capacity in. And obviously, in that painful period that we lost Comair with all of their operations, SAA doing what it was doing, it would have been tempting to do that. And the traveling public was saying there isn't enough capacity or your flights are full. It's very expensive. But the thing that struck me was that all of the airlines that remained were saying, but it's slow and steady because we're not going to just do this again and then end up having a big price war. We need to be viable, as you said earlier. You don't have any state guarantees, so you have to run as a business. And I think the whole environment and all the operators have had the same grown-up view of that to say, we're not going to flood the market with capacity. So I think that's a really good point to be made. And it's interesting now, like you say, to say supply and demand is matching now. It's taken time, but if we're there and we're able to make money and charge a fair amount for our service, then we're in a good place. And South Africa is back on an even keel as much as anything else. So I think that's really good. Rugby, let's talk rugby. In terms of the Rugby World Cup, obviously you guys beat the English in the final in the previous edition, so we won't dwell on that too much. But the Rugby World Cup and rugby's been a really important part of your marketing strategy over the last couple of years. You position yourselves as the carrier of the Springboks as much as anything else. You've incorporated their motifs on your aircraft. You did a fly past at a recent game. So what's it all about and what impact has it had? Has it been I imagine it's a huge thing to win the hearts and minds of South Africans, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, South Africa, rugby plays a very important part in our, and World Cup specifically, actually, in our history. The film Invictus probably embodies it really beautifully, where in the 95 World Cup, we had this phenomenal experience when Nelson Mandela came onto the field and supported the team in that moment. And it was really a massive unifying moment for our country across the board, for a country that was in a difficult position at the time. And it continues to be there, to be that. And I think this year, off the back of a World Cup win last year and having a strong team in the equation, the kind of vibe and energy with amongst South Africans approaching the World Cup is just massive. And so, yeah, our alliance with the Springboks, it started some time back. It was strategically, we actually signed the deal in the interest of actually trying to achieve, I think, a level of credibility that we were struggling with at the time. Being new entrants onto the market, South Africa at the time was littered with the kind of corpses of low-cost carriers that had tried but hadn't really made it. And here we were, the new kids on the block who weren't new at all. We'd been going for about 50 years before then. We were new in consumers' faces. And so that alliance and that relationship that we managed to establish really helped to maintain, get that kind of credibility on sides. And it's been phenomenal for the business ever since. We've just renewed that contract now for another 5 years. So we'll continue to be the sponsors for the national rugby team. And yeah, we're 100% behind them. As you and I are recording it now, tomorrow is a massive day. We're playing Ireland. We're hoping for the best result there, but we'll talk again when we bring you home. We're better for the second time in a row.
Okay, so he's nailed his flag to the mast there. And I've got my cup, so I'm. If those of you watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see where my loyalties lie in that respect. So if the Springboks get to the final, can we expect a 737 over the top of the Parc de France or wherever they're playing the final?
Jeez, I tell you, it's not the first time the idea has come to my mind. I think it might be a bit tricky to establish.
Try and get that one past Elmar as a low-cost carrier. Yeah. Yeah. Great branding, though. Great branding for the airline. Yeah, that would be great. Watch this space. That just jumped into my head then. I thought, oh, that'd be nice. Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much for taking the time, Kirby, because I know how busy you are with all the launches, and all the best with that. We can't wait to make sure all of those are successful long-term and beneficial, obviously, for you and those destinations. And thank you to you and the team for all you're doing in terms of connectivity for Southern Africa, because it makes a huge difference all the way down the value chain through the tourism economy, creating jobs, creating opportunities for young people, and putting Southern Africa on the map and showing that it's a unified part of the world where one country doesn't have to lose for another to benefit. You can create these multi-country, multi-city itineraries, put more capacity in the market, and actually stimulate a new market. You don't have to take market share away from anybody else. Just by bringing the price point down and that price elasticity, you can stimulate a whole new market of travelers. And that's what we want to do, is let more trade, more tourism happen between these destinations. So thanks so much, and all the best in the rugby tomorrow. I don't think you're playing, but I'm sure you'll be cheering them on.
Most certainly, I'll be playing with a malt.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody out there for listening. If you did enjoy the episode, don't hesitate and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss another episode. Also hit that share button on whichever platform you're listening with and send it to somebody you think would benefit from having a listen. And we'll see you for the next episode very soon. Take care. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.